Hello, I am David Clifton. My feast name is Haitga Mishinam Tsul, which translates to Standing Copper Beaver. I am from the Gitgat First Nation on BC's North Coast, known to many as the community of Hartley Bay. To start, I want to acknowledge the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations from where I am speaking with you today. I also want to extend a warm welcome to all hereditary and elected chiefs, councillors, matriarchs, elders, and all other attendees to the Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference 2021. I currently serve as the First Nations Business Development Manager for Meraki Resources. We are excited to be sponsoring IROC, where we believe this conference brings people and ideas together to stimulate potential new opportunities and where partnerships can grow. Meraki Resources specializes in assisting First Nations with our forestry, civil construction, and heavy-duty mechanical opportunities. We are proud to have relationships with several BC First Nations, producing robust economic, capacity, and community building results. I look forward to having constructive conversations with attendees during and after IROC. It is my pleasure to be introducing the next keynote speaker, Carol Ann Hilton, who is the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute and the Global Center of Indigenomics. Carol Ann is a dynamic national Indigenous business leader, author, speaker, and senior advisor who led the establishment of a line of thought called Indigenomics, growing from a single word to an entire movement which focuses on the rebuilding and strengthening of Indigenous economies. Thank you for joining us. It is now my pleasure to pass the mic over to Ms. Hilton.
Good afternoon. My name is Carol Ann Hilton, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute. It is my pleasure and honor today to join you at the Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference. My presentation is called Indigenomics in Action. Indigenomics has grown into a visible, tangible economic target, bringing visibility into the growing strength of the Indigenous economy. I want to introduce this concept of economic displacement that has tied our common history across the development of Canada as we know it today. The concept of economic displacement in Indigenous reality, it is important to understand there's a direct relationship between the historical economic displacement and the marginalization of Indigenous peoples today. Economic displacement is the systemic removal of Indigenous peoples from our cultural ways and our relationships to lands and resources. It is from this that Indigenomics is inspired. To understand that these effects of economic displacement of Indigenous peoples across time are demonstrated in the widening socioeconomic gap experienced by our people. In the landscape of Indigenous economic growth, some of the key features to pay attention to is the increasing pace and scale of Indigenous business, the increasing demands for capitalization to meet this escalating growth. A notable point, Indigenous entrepreneur growth is 5 times the national rate. We have a demographics that needs to be paid attention to. Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in Canada, with a population that grew by 42.5% between 2006 and 2016. Alongside this, Indigenous peoples are also the youngest population in Canada, with about 44% of the age under 25 in the 2016 census, compared to 28% in the non-Indigenous population. We're in an environment of the implementation of UNDRIP, or now known as DRIPA, into law. And finally, the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action, which describes a pathway for corporations to engage and businesses to engage with Indigenous people. We are in a new business environment. Indigenomics is modern, constructive, generative, Indigenous economic design. It is time that we come to terms with our modern Indigenous relationship. We are in a legal and an economic relationship with Indigenous peoples. We need constructive tools, resources, and investment into the Indigenous economy. We need to see Indigenous economies as generative, and we need a design for Indigenous economic growth. To describe Indigenomics as modern, constructive, generative Indigenous economic design describes the evolving Indigenous economic relationship today. This concept of Indigenomics in action. It is essential first to interrupt the status quo, to see business as usual, to push against the growing legal environment and the relationship that we have with Indigenous people, where the cost of doing nothing outweighs the risk of doing nothing and perpetuates the status quo. It is time to advance the structures, the tools, and the investment of Indigenous economic reconciliation. It is time to expand and to be able to design and establish the conditions for innovation of the development of Indigenous economic growth today. In the parameters and the trajectory of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, what is BC's response? To be able to understand and build the principles of Indigenous community-based economic development, that our livelihoods must be connected to our identity and connected to well-being, that the systems and structures of a collective economic response is based on inclusion and reconciliation, that the essence of sustainability is the space to be built into Indigenous business models, that our place-based identity reflects who we are within our businesses, and that Indigenous-led economies are essential to the success of BC and the future of our collective economy. What is happening right now is the ongoing active expression of the right to an economy. Indigenous peoples are the only ones in this country and in this province who have to fight for a right to an economy. That fight for a right to an economy has expressed itself particularly in a BC context in the historical absence of treaties. So the realization of unceded, unsurrendered territories has created a new economic space, and that is with which the concept of the $100 billion Indigenous economy is within. To be able to shape our understanding of the evolving Indigenous economic relationship, let's take one industry as an example. If we look to BC's forest industry, what we have are forest consultation and revenue sharing agreements. 4 specific points in this regard. First Nations communities receive a share of stumpage that the province collects from harvesting activities on our territories. Since the start of this program in 2013, the province has shared less than 6% of overall stumpage collected with First Nations. Taking this into consideration, the total contribution of the forest industry to the GDP of this province is approximately $13 billion per year over just the last 4 years, and of which the province has shared less than 0.5% a year of that GDP with First Nations. The current forest revenue sharing model with First Nations must change from sharing less than 6% to actually sharing 50% of stumpage revenues collected. That is Indigenomics in action. To begin to establish the pathways of Indigenomics in action, we are in an environment of the implementation of UNDRIP. In the words of Charlene Higgins from the BC Forest First Nation Council, the government must live up to the commitment and endorse and implement the forest strategy, which outlines a framework to support the implementation of UNDRIP and advance reconciliation. The forest strategy should be used to guide and inform and work under an intention paper to modernize forest policy in BC and the forest sector transition with First Nations as full partners. Indigenous-led economic development. This is Indigenomics. Charlene Higgins continues, "It's time for the BC government to put words into action to advance economic reconciliation and Indigenous prosperity and inclusion in the forestry sector. Meaningful sharing of forest revenues with all nations, not just some, supports Indigenomics and economic reconciliation with First Nations as full partners in the forestry sector. This is Indigenomics in action. It's essential to begin to understand the expression of rights and title is happening and ongoing and expressing itself daily. This expression of rights and title is facilitating Indigenous economic strength." In a recent news media release, we see the headline, "A billion-dollar boom. UNDRIP opens the door to First Nations partnerships." First Nations businesses are set to hit $100 billion in just 5 years. The realization of the ongoing unfoldment of this billion-dollar boom is what we are gathered here today to be able to understand and get ready for. Where do we see evidence of this $100 billion Indigenous economy? I draw your attention to Kitimat. In partnership with the Haisla Nation, a $40 billion mega project begins to take shape. When we understand that the essence of this project has to have Indigenous inclusion and have Indigenous leadership at the table, that is Indigenomics. We turn now to the Squamish Nation. Squamish Nation signs a $1 billion land deal that will see an LNG plant shipping gas to Asia. When we understand the magnitude of the mega projects and the implications of resources to markets, that Indigenous peoples having a seat at the economic table is essential for this province to be able to respond to. We look at a recent deal this year, the Clearwater Deal, and although this is in the Atlantic region, it refers to this growing pattern of billion-dollar participation and deals and investments into Indigenous partnerships. It leads to that question, what has happened to us and what is designed by us? Indigenomics is about design. It's about designing our economic relationships. It's about designing ourselves outside of poverty, and it's about designing ourselves beyond the Indian Act and beyond the socioeconomic gap. To describe the design principles of Indigenomics, I draw from the work of Amartya Sen, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who describes poverty is not only about the lack of money, it's not having the capability to realize one's full potential as a human being. The second design principle, poverty is the result of the systemic deprivation of opportunity. And third, economic growth without investment in human development is unsustainable and unethical. And finally, to measure what matters to well-being is essential and foundational to the concept of Indigenomics. Economic reconciliation must establish the foundation for building an inclusive economy. This is the journey from invisibility to inclusivity of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia's economy. Economic reconciliation is the process of creating and facilitating meaningful partnerships and mutually beneficial opportunities to support Indigenous economic prosperity and inclusion. This is Indigenomics. It's time to ask the question, are you ready? Because it is time. The $100 billion Indigenous economy is happening now. It's happening every day. Do we want to build from the status quo or build the pathways of Indigenous economic prosperity and a shared future? I draw on the words of Murray Sinclair, Chief Commissioner at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top, and we call on you to do the climbing. This is really about that time, that the understanding of how we participate, build the tools, the resources, the investment, the infrastructure, and the institutions of the $100 billion Indigenous economy. To be able to understand our place and our leadership, the question has always remained, who wants to play Indigenomics? Let's have the courage to do this together. And finally, I would like to invite you to the Indigenomics Institute 2022 Indigenomics Design Conference, activating the financial architecture of the $100 billion Indigenous economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol-Ann. Like we've heard throughout the day, tip of the iceberg. I think we've heard some amazing stories that have shown the potential of what Indigenous communities can do when it comes to resource management, resource opportunities. We have a lot of challenges. I believe it was Keith Matthew who talked about the grave sites and some of the other challenges that come with colonialism. But if we stick together and just continue to learn from each other as we have since time immemorial, we'll really be in a better place, and we'll just keep putting our children that much farther up the human well-being schedule. It's nice to know that we have viewers out there who have become allies. I saw the orange shirts on the day of reconciliation. We all saw who wasn't wearing a shirt on that day, but that's an issue for other people to deal with at the next election. It's up to us to do what we can to work with the communities that we work with to make them stronger, more better places to live. So that's a wrap on day one. I want to thank Auntie Sophie for getting us started on the right page at the right pace. I want to thank the other panelists for sharing their knowledge and for having the patience with my time management skills. And I look forward to seeing you all again at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Gaila Kesla, have a nice night.